Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had someone say in the comments this morning when I was reading stuff, when I was talking about my strength standards, they chimed in that, you know what, your strength standards are unreasonable because a 6'2" guy who weighs 140 pounds is never going to bench 225, right? After a year of training, that's ludicrous, but a guy who's, say, 5'8", 180 probably will. It'll probably be really easy for him, so your standards just don't fit everyone. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. You know what's ludicrous about this idea? Is that people want to completely ignore the fact that usually if you're making progress in the gym and you're training hard, the idea is that you're gaining muscle, right? That's the idea. I mean, my strength standards that I set out assume that people are training correctly and that they're actually trying to make gains. In other words, if you're 6'2" and you're perfectly content with being 140 pounds, you are still a novice lifter. Meaning at any point, even if you stayed there for 3 years, at any point you could make your noob gains. At any point you could make your noob gains. But you're choosing not to. You're choosing to bench 135 pounds. You're choosing to stay at 140 pounds and choosing not to eat enough to gain weight. You're choosing not to progress because people have to grasp that you cannot separate size and strength. All right, you can to some degree with drugs, but truth be told, if you have a guy who weighs 220 lean and uses tons of drugs, even if he does a bunch of fluff and pump, as long as his core and all his muscles are strong and well developed, he can probably move some respectable weight if he learns the form on any exercise. It might have a learning curve for him, but the guy isn't going to be weak. Now, he might not be as strong as someone who's trained without using all the drugs he used and trained really heavy, but he's not going to be weak either. So, I mean, certain substances can skew it. Site enhancement can skew it. But actual muscle growth that is built through training, lifting weights, eating food, all of those things, muscle that is built in that environment always gets dramatically stronger. You can't separate size and strength. There's only a small degree of separation between the two. Meaning we're talking about a 10 to 15% separation. So, and that's within an individual. And it doesn't mean that every person who's the same weight and height is going to be the exact same strength as someone else. There can be some variation there, but it's not going to be an enormous variation. In other words, two guys with the same fat-free mass index and the same height who are reasonably proportioned, their squat's not going to be 200 pounds different as a general rule. That would be extremely rare. So people say these things, but they're not putting it into context. That, what did this 140-pound person do? And again, they're completely missing the point. I'm not saying every person who trains is going to reach these numbers, right? I'm not saying every person who trains is going to reach these numbers. And for those curious, what I mean is my noob expectations. I think a healthy young man who's been training over 1 year should in general be able to bench 225 for reps. So that's around 100 kilos. Squat 315 for reps, that's about 140 kilos, and he should be able to deadlift 180 kilos, or about 405. That's a reasonable expectation if they trained and ate correctly. Now, people will say, well, not everyone wants to bulk up and be a fat ass. Well, I can tell you right now, a guy who's 6'2", who trains really hard for a year, who bulks up to 200 pounds, is not going to be fat. In other words, if he trained hard, if he'd set away in 140, if the guy at 6'2" weighed 200, he is not going to be fat. Now, he might not be ripped, but he won't be fat if he spent a solid year getting as strong as possible on 4 or 5 big basic barbell lifts, and then he got up to 200 pounds. Again, I can assure you this guy is not fat. And in fact, a lot of these people who start really skinny like that, if you're 6'2" and you start at 140, you're emaciated. Meaning, people who have bigger frames can bypass these gains numbers that I talk about. Because when I talk about people should only gain about X amount of muscle mass over their training career, that usually assumes that they started at a healthy, active body weight. In other words, they weren't emaciated. They weren't underweight when they started. Because someone who's underweight or anorexic or whatever can gain sometimes 10, 15, 20 pounds of muscle without ever even lifting. They need to get up to a healthy muscle mass for their frame, and then that person can gain another 20 pounds of muscle. So a guy who's 140 at 6'2", using that example, is extremely underweight. He doesn't even have the amount of muscle he should have on his frame if he was heavier. Let's say he weighed 6'2" and was 170 or 180 and had never lifted weights in his life, didn't exercise, he would have more muscle. So this is a person who's starting extremely underweight, and how could they possibly stay at 140 if they're gaining muscle? They're not. They're not. So these ideas are ludicrous. And when people argue about my strength standards, they're arguing from the perspective of someone who is choosing actively not to gain body weight, who's saying, I'm not trying to get bigger. I'm not trying to get bigger. Because ultimately that's what we're talking about with resistance training. When a person has training goals and they say, hey, I'm trying to make progress in the gym, you don't make progress in the gym without gaining. So if you're going to stay at the same body weight, you're going to have to recomposition. In other words, you might have to lose 15 pounds of body fat to make your new gains and stay at roughly the same body weight. And you may not have 15 pounds of body fat to spare in terms of being at a healthy body fat, especially if you're someone who's that light. He doesn't have that really to spare. So people need to understand that that's what we're talking about. And yes, height matters. Height matters. But what we generally find, the reason we have strength standards based upon body weight is because, number one, we should be gaining muscle and weight over the years as we train, obviously, because you're getting bigger. Well, size equals weight also, unless you're losing a proportionate amount of body fat to go with your muscle gains. And if you're getting stronger, you will be gaining muscle. The scale's going to go up. The scale is going to go up. But number two, height matters. Shorter guys are stronger pound for pound, right? Pound for pound strength, short guys are king, because they don't have to move the weight as far. In other words, their bones weigh less and they need less muscle mass to move the same weight, because again, moving 300 pounds 18 inches is harder than moving 300 pounds 12 inches. Basic physics. And if you look at the motors involved, the motor moving it being your muscles, it takes less work to do it, so therefore a smaller muscle can move it a shorter distance. So the shorter guy, due to his leverages, moving the weight a shorter distance, doesn't need as much muscle or therefore as much body weight, and he has less frame, everything else to support to add to that body weight. He's going to be stronger pound for pound. So these strength standards assume, oftentimes if you're reaching these strength standards, you're probably at a good body weight for your height. And so if you're underweight for your height, that's going to be a problem. And here's what I would say. Let's take you a 6'2" guy who actually trained in 8, and instead of 140, what happens if he weighs 240? How strong do you think that guy's going to be? Guy who's 6'2", weighs 240, and has been training really hard with heavy weights for 2 years and bulks up to 240. All right, that guy's going to be strong. I can tell you right now, that guy is going to squat over 400 pounds, if not more. That guy's going to deadlift over 500 pounds. That guy is going to bench over 300 pounds. Easily. If he spent a couple of years training heavy and hard and bulking up. So therein lies the difference. And 240 is a totally acceptable body weight for a 6'2" or 6'3" lifter. So people need to put this stuff in context and quit thinking in terms of lanky, because lanky is about undereating. Just because a person is what you're thinking of as a lanky build, they're also an undereater who doesn't have any muscle either. Because look at the world's strongest men competitors. Sorry about that. Turn that off. Look at the world's strongest men competitors, for example. A lot of them, before they started lifting, because a lot of these guys are 6'4", 6'5", 6'8", they would have looked like a lanky basketball player when they were 17 or 18 if they weren't lifting, right? But what happens when they fill out? All right, it's not that you're built lanky, it's that you're lanky when you're not eating. You're tall with long arms and legs, because that goes with being tall, and you're not eating. You're under eating, so therefore you're skinny. Guys who are tall, guys who are over 6 foot, if you're 6'2" plus and you lift and you're eating, you're going to be over 200 pounds. You're going to be over 200 pounds. It's simply going to happen unless you are intentionally almost starving yourself. Because if you think about it, a guy who's that tall, who is really bulked up and gained a lot of muscle and a lot of strength, they're going to carry a lot of body weight because they have a big frame. So a lot of times this concept of lanky has nothing to do with your frame other than the fact that you're 6'2" or 6'3", right? Or 6'5". More to do with the fact that you chose not to eat more food for whatever reason. Maybe you couldn't afford more food, and didn't lift hard and heavy. So again, these ideas are ridiculous. A lot of these times when people make these arguments against strength standards, they're working off the assumption that a person is staying at an ultra low body weight relative to their height. And obviously, if you're underweight, you haven't gained a whole hell of a lot of muscle. And that's the point, that muscle mass equals strength. Muscle mass equals strength. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.